Welcome to Dark Domain, where the quietest places hide the darkest secrets. Tonight, we've got 3 stories that'll have you double-checking your locks, your attic, and maybe even your own mind. First, a family finds out they've had an unexpected tenant in the attic, rent-free, of course. Next, men are disappearing without a trace, and finally, a voice so convincing you might just start taking orders from it. So, sit back, lock your doors, and enjoy, because once you enter the dark domain, there's no turning back. The Stranger in the Attic. It was a chilly October evening, and I had just gotten back from work. My wife Megan and our daughter Sophie were busy carving pumpkins in the kitchen, getting ready for Halloween. We lived in a quiet suburban neighborhood in Toledo, Ohio, and life was fairly predictable. I liked it that way. But that night, something felt off. After dinner, Megan asked me to go up to the attic and bring down our box of Halloween decorations. She was big on decorating for the holidays, and I figured I'd get it over with while she and Sophie cleaned up the kitchen. The attic was a small, cramped space above the second floor, accessible by a rickety ladder that folded down from the ceiling. I hadn't been up there in a while, but I knew exactly where the decorations were, tucked in a corner near a stack of old boxes we hadn't touched since we moved in. As I climbed the ladder, the musty smell of old cardboard and insulation hit me. I flicked on the dim light bulb hanging from the ceiling and started rummaging through the boxes. Just as I found the Halloween bin, I heard something, a soft creaking sound like wood bending under pressure. I froze. The attic was full of old wood beams, so it wasn't unusual for the floor to creak. But this sound wasn't from where I was standing. It came from the far corner, near the vent that overlooked the backyard. I told myself it was nothing, probably just the house settling or a draft pushing something out of place. But the noise was unmistakable. It sounded like something, or someone, had shifted weight on the floorboards. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the box of decorations. My mind raced, but I told myself I was overreacting. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone up there. Slowly, I turned and glanced toward the dark corner of the attic. Nothing. Just a pile of boxes and some old furniture we had stored away. But the uneasy feeling lingered. I grabbed the box of decorations and made my way back to the ladder, carefully lowering the bin down first before climbing down myself. Megan was waiting for me at the bottom, and I tried to shake off the weirdness as I handed her the box. "You okay?" she asked, noticing the look on my face. "Yeah," I said, forcing a smile. "Just thought I heard something up there. Probably nothing." Megan laughed lightly. "This old house always makes weird noises." I nodded, but something still didn't feel right. That night, after Sophie was tucked into bed and the house was quiet, I found myself lying awake, thinking about the attic. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, just my imagination running wild. But then, around 1 a.m., I heard it again. A creak, followed by another. This time it was louder, coming from directly above our bedroom. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding in my chest. I strained to listen, and there it was again. A faint shuffling sound, like something or someone was moving around in the attic. I nudged Megan awake. "Do you hear that?" She groggily turned over. "What?" "I don't hear anything." "There's someone in the attic," I whispered, my voice shaky. "I heard it earlier too." Megan sat up, her face paling. "You're scaring me." "I'm not kidding," I said, already climbing out of bed. "Stay here. I'm going to check it out." I grabbed a flashlight from the nightstand and headed for the attic ladder. The house was completely still, except for the faint noise above us. I climbed the ladder slowly, the beam from my flashlight shaking as I reached the top. The attic was eerily quiet. I stood at the entrance for a moment, listening, but the shuffling had stopped. I shone the flashlight around the room, sweeping over the boxes and old furniture. Everything looked the same as before. But then, as I stepped deeper into the attic, my foot caught on something. I pointed the flashlight down and my blood ran cold. There, on the floor, was a crumpled blanket, and next to it, an empty jar of peanut butter. My heart raced as I realized what I was seeing. Someone had been living up here. I stumbled backward, nearly dropping the flashlight. That's when I heard it again, a soft creak from the far corner. I whipped the light around and caught a glimpse of movement. A figure, hunched over behind the boxes. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice trembling. "Come out!" For a moment, nothing happened. Then, slowly, the figure stepped into the light. It was a man. His clothes were filthy, his face gaunt and pale. He looked like he hadn't bathed in weeks. His eyes were wide, almost wild, as he stared at me. He didn't say a word. I didn't know what to do. My mind raced with fear and confusion. How long had he been up here? How did he get in? My hands shook as I took a step back, keeping the flashlight trained on him. "I don't want any trouble," the man finally muttered, his voice raspy. "I've been staying here for a few days. Just needed somewhere warm." "Get out," I managed to say, my voice barely a whisper. "Get out of my house." The man raised his hands, showing he meant no harm. "I'm leaving, I swear. I didn't touch anything. I just needed a place to sleep." I watched in horror as he slowly moved toward the ladder, his eyes never leaving mine. He climbed down without another word, and I heard the front door open and close quietly a moment later. I stayed up the rest of the night, sitting in the living room with a kitchen knife clutched in my hand, just in case. Megan sat beside me, wide-eyed and terrified. We didn't speak much, too shaken by what had just happened. The police arrived shortly after, but by then the man was long gone. They searched the attic and confirmed what I already knew. He had been living there for at least a few days, maybe longer. The jar of peanut butter and the blanket were proof of that. We changed the locks the next morning and made sure every window was securely shut. But the sense of safety I'd always felt in our home was gone. Now, every time I hear a creak or a shuffle in the attic, my mind goes back to that night. And I wonder, how long had he been watching us before I finally heard him? The Vanishing Men. People go missing all the time. You work as a detective long enough and you learn to accept that. Runaways, abductions, people who just want to disappear. But what's been happening in Little Rock? It's different. This time it's the men, young, healthy men, vanishing without a trace. No sign of struggle, no clues left behind, and each one looks like they've been erased from existence. My name is Luke Hansen. I've been with the Little Rock PD for over 12 years, and I've seen a lot of weird things. But this case, it's the first one that's made me question everything I know. The first victim was Eric Wilkins, 28 years old, a construction worker. His wife reported him missing 2 months ago. At first, it looked like any other disappearance. Maybe he'd taken off, or worse. We searched everywhere, the usual haunts, his work site, the bars he liked to visit after work. Nothing. A few weeks later, another man disappeared. Jared Taylor, 35, an insurance salesman. Again, no trace. The only thing these guys had in common was that they were both young and in good health. They didn't know each other, didn't run in the same circles. Yet they were both gone. Then it started happening more frequently. In just a few weeks, we had 4 more men missing. Same age range, no connections. The city was starting to get nervous, and frankly, so was I. We didn't catch a break until a week ago, when we found the body of the 5th man to disappear. Sean Martinez, 31 years old. His body was discovered in an alley downtown, behind an old abandoned warehouse. He was lying face up, his skin completely pale, drained of all color. But it wasn't just his skin. It was like the life had been sucked out of him. His hair, once thick and dark, had gone white. His eyes, wide open, stared blankly at the sky, lifeless. I remember crouching beside the body, the heat of the summer pressing down on me as I examined the scene. There wasn't a single mark on him. No sign of injury, no blood, no struggle. It was as if he had simply stopped living. The autopsy didn't help much either. The medical examiner said he died of unknown causes, his body showing signs of extreme malnutrition, dehydration, and blood loss. But here's the thing. He wasn't cut. There were no wounds, no punctures, nothing to explain how his blood had been drained. It was like it had simply vanished from his body. I started looking into the other missing men again, trying to find anything that could link them. The pattern was hard to see at first, but then it hit me. All of them had been seen last in a specific part of the city, around the same area where we'd found Sean Martinez's body. It was an old district, a place that used to thrive decades ago but had fallen into disrepair. Empty warehouses, abandoned buildings, the kind of place where no one goes unless they have a reason to be there. It was a dead zone, almost forgotten by the rest of the city. I decided to head down there myself, check out the area. It wasn't long before I found the warehouse where Sean had been found. The place was run down with shattered windows and graffiti covering the walls. The front door was chained shut, but there was an entrance around the back, one that had clearly been used recently. Inside, the air was thick and stale, the smell of mildew clinging to everything. The warehouse was huge, with tall ceilings and rows of rusted shelves, but it was mostly empty. As I moved deeper into the building, I noticed something strange, a trail of white powder on the floor, like chalk dust, leading toward a small room at the back of the warehouse. I followed the trail, my flashlight cutting through the dim light. The room was small, barely more than a closet, with a single chair in the middle and an old metal cabinet pushed against the wall. There was more white powder on the floor, almost like it had been deliberately scattered in a pattern, leading directly to the chair. But what really caught my attention was the photograph sitting on the chair. It was old, faded, and curled at the edges. In it, there was a man, dressed in what looked like a formal military uniform, standing beside another man I didn't recognize. The first man's face was unmistakable. It was Sean Martinez, but the photo looked like it had been taken years ago, decades even. How was that possible? My heart started to race. I shoved the photo into my jacket and quickly made my way out of the warehouse. I couldn't shake the feeling that the photo was the key to everything. I spent hours digging through old records trying to figure out where it had come from. And then I found it, an old military experiment from the 1950s, something called Project Shade. The experiment had been designed to create soldiers who didn't need to sleep, soldiers who could stay awake for days, even weeks, without rest. But the project had been a failure. The test subjects had started to experience strange side effects, fatigue, hallucinations, and eventually, a complete breakdown of their physical bodies. Some had even gone missing, disappearing without a trace. The man in the photograph, the one standing beside Sean Martinez, had been one of those test subjects. His name was Edward Black, and he had vanished from the military base shortly after the experiment was shut down. The pieces were starting to fall into place, but I still didn't understand what it meant. How could Edward Black, a man from the 1950s, be connected to the recent disappearances? And why did Sean Martinez look exactly like him in that old photo? I went back to the warehouse the next night, determined to get answers. This time I wasn't alone. I brought my partner, Dan, with me, and we searched the entire building, looking for anything we might have missed. We found Edward. He was hiding in the basement, hunched over in the darkness. His skin was pale, almost translucent, and his eyes were wide, bloodshot, filled with a strange kind of hunger. But he wasn't old, not like he should have been. He looked barely older than 30, the same age as Sean when he died. Edward looked up at us, his breathing shallow, and I could see the desperation in his face. "It wasn't supposed to be like this," he whispered, his voice trembling. "I can't stop. I have to feed." Before we could react, he lunged at us, moving faster than any man his age should have been able to. Dan pulled his gun, but Edward was on him in an instant, his hands gripping Dan's throat, his fingers digging into the skin. I grabbed my flashlight and swung it hard, smashing it across Edward's head. He staggered back, giving Dan just enough time to scramble away. Edward collapsed to the ground, gasping for air, his body convulsing. And then, just like that, he stopped moving. The medical examiner couldn't explain what happened to Edward. His body was the same as the others, pale, drained, and lifeless. But this time, we had a name. And we had the photo. The official story is that Edward Black died decades ago, a victim of an experiment gone wrong. But I know the truth. I saw what he became. Whatever they did to him, it kept him alive and hungry, feeding off the life of others to keep himself going. The disappearances have stopped for now, but I can't shake the feeling that this isn't over. There are still too many questions, too many things that don't make sense. And every time I close my eyes, I see Edward's face. I don't think he was the only one. The Stranger in the Woods. I've lived in Augusta, Maine for most of my life, and in all those years, nothing much changes around here. The same quiet streets, the same small-town vibe, the same cold winters that freeze you to your bones. But last month, something changed. Something dark. Something that doesn't belong here. My name is Mike Dawson, and I'm a paramedic. I've seen all kinds of things on the job. Car accidents, heart attacks, the occasional overdose. But nothing prepared me for the night we got a call about a body found in the woods just outside town. A hiker had come across it and called 911, claiming the man wasn't moving but wasn't dead either. He said it was like the guy was frozen, stuck somehow. I was on shift with my partner, Jake. We grabbed our gear and headed out, the cold night air biting at our faces as we reached the edge of the woods. It wasn't far from the old logging trail, a place we rarely got calls from even during hunting season. But tonight was different. When we arrived, the hiker was waiting for us by his truck, pale and visibly shaken. He pointed us toward the spot deeper in the woods, and we started our hike in, flashlights cutting through the thick darkness. It didn't take long to find the body. At first glance, the man seemed completely still. He was lying face up in the snow, eyes wide open, his skin pale and covered in frost. But something was off. His clothes didn't fit the weather, just a light jacket and jeans. No gear, no backpack, nothing to suggest he'd been prepared for the freezing cold. I knelt down to check for a pulse, expecting him to be dead. But he wasn't. His pulse was slow, too slow. But it was there, faint, weak, but steady. He was alive. "Get the stretcher," I told Jake, my voice low. "We need to get him out of here, fast." As I leaned in closer to examine him, something even stranger caught my eye. His face. It was shifting, changing. For a split second, it looked different, like it wasn't his face at all, like his features had blurred, twisted before snapping back into place. I froze, my mind racing. I had never seen anything like it before. "Mike?" Jake called from behind me, pulling the stretcher through the snow. "You okay?" I shook off the feeling, telling myself it was just a trick of the light, the shadows playing with my mind. "Yeah, let's get him to the hospital." We rushed him back to the ambulance and loaded him in. The whole ride back to Augusta General, I kept checking his vitals, trying to figure out what was going on. His body temperature was low, way too low for someone who should still be alive, and his breathing was shallow, almost non-existent. But what really unsettled me was his face. Every time I glanced at him, it looked different. Subtle changes, like his bone structure was shifting beneath the skin. One minute he looked young, the next, older, like a completely different person. By the time we pulled into the hospital, I was on edge. I kept telling myself there had to be a logical explanation, but nothing made sense. We handed him over to the ER team and they wheeled him off to a private room. I stayed behind to fill out the paperwork, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Really wrong. 2 days later, I got a call from Dr. Nelson, one of the doctors at Augusta General. He asked me to come back to the hospital immediately, said there was something I needed to see. When I arrived, he took me straight to the room where they were keeping the man we'd found in the woods, except it wasn't the same man. The patient in the bed looked completely different, younger, clean-shaven with a completely different facial structure. I stared at him in disbelief. "That's not the guy we brought in," I said, my voice shaking. Dr. Nelson shook his head. We ran his fingerprints. It's him, Mike. Same man. I felt the blood drain from my face. How is that possible? That's what we're trying to figure out, Nelson said, his voice low. There's more. He's awake. I followed the doctor into the patient's room, my heart pounding in my chest. The man was sitting up in bed, staring out the window. He didn't acknowledge us when we entered, didn't even seem to notice we were there. I approached him slowly. Can you tell us what happened? How did you end up in the woods? For a moment, he didn't respond. Then, slowly, he turned to face me, his eyes dark and unfocused. I was running. From what? I pressed. His lips twitched into a faint smile, but it wasn't a reassuring one. From what I used to be. I exchanged a glance with Dr. Nelson. What do you mean? The man's expression darkened. They're looking for me. They always find me. Who's looking for you? His eyes shifted, unfocused, as if he were seeing something that wasn't there. You wouldn't understand. No one does. I was about to press further when his face changed again. Right in front of me, his features twisted. His jawline softened, his eyes shifted, and within seconds he looked like an entirely different person. I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat. What are you? The man, or whatever he was, gave me a tired smile, like someone who had lived 1,000 lifetimes and was ready to give up. I've been many things, but they won't let me go. They never do. Before I could ask him anything else, the machines monitoring his vitals began to beep rapidly. His body convulsed, his skin paling even more. Dr. Nelson rushed to the bedside, but within seconds it was over. The man lay still, his face shifting one last time before settling on a blank, neutral expression. He was dead. The official report said he died of hypothermia and exposure. They listed him as an unidentified John Doe, despite the fact that his fingerprints had matched multiple missing persons cases spanning decades. People from different parts of the country, all of whom had vanished without a trace. But I know what I saw. He wasn't just running from something. He was running from himself, from whatever curse or condition had taken hold of him. Something that allowed him to change, to become someone else, over and over again. But no matter how many times he changed, he couldn't escape. And now I can't escape it either. I keep thinking about his words, the way he looked at me, like he knew something I didn't, like he was warning me. Sometimes late at night I see his face in my dreams, but it's not the face of the man we found. It's different every time, and I can't shake the feeling that somehow he's still out there, waiting. Thanks for venturing into the shadows with us here at Dark Domain. If these stories left you questioning what's really in control, you're not alone. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you never miss the next terrifying tale. Until next time, stay sharp, because in the Dark Domain, control is just an illusion.